The Three Buddies and the Diamond. It was a sweltering March afternoon when John, Pete, and Mike met up on the banks of the Colorado River, hauling their beat-up canoes in hopes that were even more worn out. The three friends, all pushing 40, knew these waters like the back of their hands. They'd been fishing together since they were kids, back when their families still believed the river could support a man for life. But times had changed. The fish were getting scarce, the bills were piling up, and their wives had started asking those questions every man dreads. So what now, honey? What are we going to do? John, the oldest of the three, had prematurely gray hair and hands calloused from decades of holding nets and fishing rods. He looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the waters gold, and let out a deep sigh. "You all know why I called you out here today," he said, his gravelly voice breaking the silence. "It ain't to fish, at least not for fish." Pete, a short but bull-strong man, frowned. His thick eyebrows came together in a single line as he adjusted his faded straw hat. "John, you ain't serious about that gold mannin' story, are you?" Mike, the youngest and most nervous of the three, swallowed hard. He'd always been the dreamer of the group, the one who believed in legends and hidden treasures. But now, facing reality, his hands trembled slightly as he organized the gear in his canoe. "I heard the rumors, too. They say folks are striking it rich upriver. Precious stones worth more than our house, our boat, our whole damn life." John nodded slowly. He'd spent weeks listening to stories in the town bars, stories of prospectors who came with empty pockets and left wealthy. Stories that seemed like fairy tales, but came from serious men he'd known for years. "My wife's pregnant," Pete said suddenly, breaking through his own thoughts. "If I don't get money soon, I'm going to have to sell the house, and y'all know what that means." All three knew. It meant leaving, abandoning the only place they'd ever known, looking for work in the big cities where men like them were just three more faces lost in the crowd. "Then it's settled," John declared. "We're heading upriver. We're going to try our luck." The Colorado River back then was different from what we know today, wilder, more dangerous, but also more generous with its secrets. The banks were covered with dense vegetation that seemed to whisper ancient stories. Legends told that the river held treasures left by gold miners centuries ago, that its sands contained diamonds brought by rains from distant mountains. The next morning, before sunrise, the three friends set off. Their canoes cut through the silent water like knives slicing open the belly of a big fish. The sound of paddles hitting water was almost hypnotic, marking the rhythm of a journey that would change their lives forever. Pete rowed hard, his muscles tense with effort. Drops of sweat ran down his face, but he didn't slow the pace. There was an iron determination in his eyes, the determination of a man who had no choice but to win. Mike followed behind, his eyes constantly scanning the banks for signs. He'd studied old maps, talked with retired prospectors, memorized every bend in the river that might lead them to gold. His heart was racing, mixing fear and excitement in equal parts. John led the way, as he always had. His decades of experience on the river were invaluable. He knew every rapid, every submerged rock, every spot where the water got treacherous. But even he had never gone as far upriver as they intended to go. The first day of travel was peaceful. They stopped for lunch on a white sand beach, where they built a fire and grilled some fish they'd caught along the way. The conversation was lively, full of plans and hopes. They talked about what they'd do with the money, how their lives would change, how they could finally give their families the comfort they deserved. But as they traveled further upriver, the landscape changed. The trees grew taller, denser. The sky seemed more distant, covered by a green canopy that filtered sunlight into golden rays. The silence became deeper, broken only by the sound of water and the occasional cry of some distant bird. On the third night, they camped on a small island in the middle of the river. They built a campfire and warmed themselves around it, but the mood had changed. They were more serious, more cautious. The reality of the adventure they'd gotten themselves into was beginning to weigh on them. "Y'all think we're doing the right thing?" Mike asked, staring at the flames dancing before him. "There ain't no right or wrong thing," John replied. "There's just what we gotta do." Pete stayed quiet, but his fists were clenched. He was thinking about his wife, the child on the way, the responsibility weighing on his shoulders. He couldn't fail, not this time. On the third day, they found the first signs of mining activity. Pieces of wood floating in the water, remains of abandoned camps, marks in the vegetation along the banks. They were getting close to the region they were looking for. Mike's heart raced when he spotted an old punctured canoe beached in a small cove. It was a sign that others had passed through here, others who might have found what they were looking for. "Look over there," Pete whispered, pointing to the right bank. On the riverbank, half hidden by vegetation, was a torn tent, the remains of a camp that seemed to have been abandoned in a hurry. Pieces of mining equipment were scattered across the sand, rusty sieves, broken shovels, pieces of hose. "Let's take a look," John decided. They pulled their canoes to shore and stepped onto solid ground. The earth was soft under their feet, a mixture of sand and decomposed leaves that gave way with each step. The air was heavy with humidity and the smell of the forest. The abandoned camp was bigger than it had seemed from the water. It had been the temporary home of at least 4 or 5 men. The marks of their footprints were still visible in the wet sand. Rotting food scraps attracted flies that buzzed incessantly. But the most intriguing thing was how everything had been left behind. It didn't look like the prospectors had left by choice. It looked like they had fled. "What do you all think happened here?" Mike asked, examining an iron pot that still had food remains stuck to the bottom. "Maybe they found what they were looking for and took off," Pete suggested, but his voice didn't sound convincing. John was more interested in a pile of dirt that had been dug up and then covered again. He grabbed one of the abandoned shovels and started digging. The earth was loose, easy to remove. After a few minutes of work, his shovel hit something hard. "There's something here," he said. The other two came closer, anxious. John kept digging until he exposed a small wooden box, about the size of a shoebox. It was wet and covered with mud, but seemed solid. With trembling hands, he pulled it from the hole and placed it on a flat rock. The box had a simple lock that had been forced open. The lid opened easily. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was something that all 3 men held their breath over. It was a diamond the size of a walnut, clear as water, but capturing sunlight and returning it in thousands of different colors. They'd never seen anything so beautiful, so perfect, so valuable. "Holy shit," Pete whispered. Mike couldn't speak. He just stared at the precious stone as if it were a miracle materialized before his eyes. John picked up the diamond with reverent care. It was heavy, real, genuine. It was worth a fortune, worth several fortunes, worth more money than the 3 of them could ever dream of making fishing. "Why did they leave this here?" Mike finally asked.
It was a question that haunted all of them. Men don't abandon diamonds like this, not unless something very serious forces them to leave. John examined the camp more carefully. Now that he knew what to look for, he began to notice details he'd missed before. Signs of struggle in the sand, equipment broken not by use, but by violence. A dark stain in the earth that could be blood. "I think something terrible happened here," he said quietly. But Pete had already made a decision. "Don't matter what happened. What matters is we got this now," he said, pointing at the diamond. "We can leave. We can go home rich." Mike nodded vigorously. "Pete's right. This is our chance. Maybe the only chance we'll ever get." John hesitated. 40 years of life on the river had taught him that nothing good comes easy. But he looked at his friends, thought about their families, their needs, and kept his doubts to himself. "All right," he said, "let's head back." But things are never that simple when there's this much money involved. As they prepared their canoes for the return trip, they started discussing how to divide the diamond. It seemed like a simple conversation at first. 3 men, 1 diamond, 3 equal parts. But Pete was the first to raise objections. "Hold up a minute," he said. "I got a pregnant wife. I got more responsibility than you two. Maybe I should get a bigger share." Mike was outraged. "What do you mean? We've been partners from the beginning. We all took the same risks." "But I was the only one who really believed in this trip from the start. Y'all came along kind of reluctant." John tried to calm things down. "Easy there, fellas. Let's think this through. We got enough money for all of us to live like kings for the rest of our lives. We don't need to fight." But the seed of discord had already been planted. During the return trip, tension grew. Each of the 3 began looking at the others with suspicion. The diamond, which should have been the solution to all their problems, was becoming the biggest problem of all. Pete started insisting that he should get half the diamond, leaving John and Mike to split the other half. Mike argued that he'd been the first to suggest the prospecting trip, so he deserved a bigger share. John, trying to keep the peace, offered to take less, but that only made the other 2 more suspicious of his intentions. On the first night of the return trip, they camped on an isolated beach. The conversation around the campfire was tense, full of veiled accusations and growing mistrust. "Where's the diamond now?" Mike asked suddenly. John pointed to his backpack. "With me, like we agreed." "Why with you?" Pete questioned. "Who said you're the most trustworthy of us?" "I'm the oldest, got more experience," John replied, starting to get irritated. "Age don't mean honesty," Mike shot back. "Maybe you're planning to keep it all for yourself." "That's ridiculous," John said, but his voice sounded defensive. The argument heated up, voices rose, accusations flew, and for the first time in decades of friendship, the 3 men looked at each other as enemies. Pete stood up abruptly. "You know what? I'm going to take a walk. Need to think." He left the circle of firelight and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. John and Mike sat in awkward silence, each lost in their own dark thoughts. Half an hour later, Pete still hadn't returned. John started getting worried. "Pete! Pete! Where are you?" No answer. Mike stood up, nervous. Maybe he got lost. Or maybe... What? Maybe he went to get help. Maybe he's planning to rob us. Paranoia was setting in. John frantically checked his backpack. The diamond was still there, wrapped in the same oiled cloth. But for how long? They called for Pete until they were hoarse, but he didn't answer. They spent the night keeping watch, taking turns, each distrusting the other. When the sun rose, Pete still hadn't returned. "We gotta look for him," John said. "Or we could just leave. If he abandoned us, why should we wait for him?" John looked at Mike with horror. "He's our friend, our buddy. We can't just abandon him." "Friend?" Mike laughed bitterly. "Friends don't try to rob each other." But John had already decided. He grabbed his backpack, made sure the diamond was safe, and started looking for Pete's tracks in the woods. He found them after an hour of searching. Footprints in the mud leading into the forest, following an almost invisible trail that led away from the river. "Mike, come here. I found his trail." Mike approached reluctantly. The footprints were definitely Pete's, recognizable by the old boots with the hole in the right sole. They followed the trail for almost 2 hours, going deeper and deeper into the thick woods. The air got heavier, more humid. Insects buzzed around their heads, and low branches scratched their arms and faces. Finally, they reached a small clearing where the trail ended. Pete was there. He was sitting on a rock, his back to them, perfectly still. John called his name, but he didn't respond. They approached slowly, a cold fear growing in their hearts. Pete was dead. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no wounds. He simply seemed to have sat on the rock and stopped. His eyes were open, fixed on something only he could see. A strange expression frozen on his face. Not exactly fear, but something close to it. Surprise, maybe, or understanding. "What happened to him?" Mike whispered, his voice trembling. John moved closer to check for a pulse, though he knew he wouldn't find one. Pete's skin was cold, stiff. He'd been dead for hours. "Maybe it was his heart," John said, but he didn't believe his own words. 40-year-old men, strong as bulls, don't just die of heart failure. Mike was examining the ground around the rock. "John," he said slowly, "look at this." In the soft earth around Pete, there were other footprints. Footprints that didn't belong to any of the three friends. They were larger, deeper, and had a strange shape, as if whoever made them walked differently, not completely human. "Animal?" John suggested, though he knew they weren't animal tracks. Mike shook his head. "I don't know any animal that leaves tracks like that." They stood there for a few minutes trying to process what had happened. Their friend was dead, and they had no idea why. Worse still, something or someone had been there with him before he died. "We got to get out of here," Mike finally said. "Now."
John agreed. They picked Pete up in their arms. He was heavy, very heavy, and started carrying him back to camp. It was the least they could do for their friend, give him a decent burial. But halfway back, they encountered another problem. The strange footprints didn't end at the clearing. They continued, following the trail, toward the river, toward their camp. "John," Mike whispered, stopping suddenly, "if these tracks lead to our camp, then whatever happened to Pete might be waiting for us there," John finished. They carefully lowered Pete's body and looked at each other. Each could see the fear in the other's eyes, but there was also determination. They'd come too far to give up now. "The diamond," Mike said. "We can't leave it here." John checked his backpack once more. The precious stone was still there, glowing softly in the filtered light of the woods. But now it didn't seem so much like a treasure as a curse. "You think this has to do with the diamond?" Mike asked. "I don't know," John replied, "but I'm starting to understand why the other prospectors abandoned their camp." They hid Pete's body under some leaves and branches, promising to come back to bury him properly. Then, armed only with machetes and courage, they began cautiously approaching their camp. What they found there made them question everything they thought they knew about the world. Their canoes were still on the beach where they'd left them, but something was different. There were more strange footprints in the sand around them, and there was something else. Symbols drawn in the sand, complex geometric shapes that didn't seem to have been made by human hands. "What is this?" Mike whispered. John didn't answer. He was too busy trying to understand the symbols. They seemed familiar somehow, as if he'd seen something similar before, but he couldn't remember where. Suddenly, they heard a sound coming from the woods behind them. It wasn't really a sound. It was more like the echo of a sound, something that reached them filtered through layers of reality. They turned slowly. There, at the edge of the forest, was a figure. It was tall, taller than any man they'd ever seen. Its form was vaguely human, but there was something wrong with the proportions. The arms were too long, the legs moved strangely, and where its face should be, there was only shadow. The creature, because there was no other word to describe it, began moving toward them. Its steps made no sound, but the earth compressed under its feet, leaving those strange footprints they'd seen in the clearing. John and Mike were paralyzed with terror. It was as if their muscles had turned to lead, their lungs had forgotten how to breathe. The fear was so pure, so primitive, that it reduced them to cornered animals. The creature stopped a few yards from them. And then, impossibly but undeniably, it spoke. Its voice didn't come from its mouth if it had one, but seemed to emerge from the air around them, from the trees, from the earth itself. "The diamond," the voice said, each word echoing as if spoken in an empty cathedral. "You cannot take it." John found his voice somewhere deep inside himself. "Why?" he managed to whisper. "It is not just a stone. It is the tear of the earth. It is power. It is responsibility. It is destruction." Mike took a step back, stumbling in the sand. We just need the money. We got families." "Everyone has families. Everyone has needs. But not everyone can carry the weight of what you have found." John felt the backpack weighing on his shoulders, as if the diamond had multiplied by 1,000. "What do you want from us?" "A choice," the creature said. "You can leave now, leave the diamond here, and return to your simple but safe lives. Or you can try to take it, and discover why so many others failed before you." "And if we don't choose either?" Mike asked, with more courage than he really felt. The creature extended one of its impossibly long arms, pointing toward the woods where they'd left Pete. "Then you choose as your friend chose." John swallowed hard. "Pete saw you?" "Pete saw the truth. He saw what the diamond really is, where it comes from, what it means to have it. His heart could not bear the knowledge." "So you killed him," Mike accused, finding his anger somewhere in the depths of his terror. "No," the creature replied, and there was something almost sad in its impossible voice. "I merely showed him reality. He was the one who chose not to be able to live with it." John felt his legs trembling. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, grab his canoe and paddle away from there as fast as possible. But there was another part of him that had dreamed of wealth his entire difficult life that whispered to him to try. "What kind of reality?" he asked, surprised by his own courage. The creature remained silent for a long moment. Then it began to speak, and its words painted images in the minds of the two men, images they would never be able to forget. "This diamond did not form in the depths of the earth. It was born from pain, from greed, from human suffering concentrated over centuries. Each facet reflects not light, but tears. Each sparkle comes not from purity, but from blood spilled for its sake." The images became more vivid. John and Mike could see flashes of past lives: Spanish conquistadors killing natives for precious stones, slaves dying in dark mines, families destroyed for greed, wars fought over diamonds. "Whoever possesses it," the creature continued, "carries all this weight with them, all this suffering. Eventually, it destroys them from within, as it destroyed your friend." Mike was crying, though he didn't know when the tears had started. But we just want to help our families. We don't want to hurt anybody." "Intention doesn't matter," the creature said gently. "The weight remains the same." John took the backpack off his shoulders with trembling hands. He could feel the diamond inside pulsing like a sick heart. Now that he knew the truth, it seemed to burn through the fabric. "What if we took it anyway?" he asked. "What would happen?" "You would become richer beyond your wildest dreams for a time, but the wealth would come with a price. First, your minds, paranoia, distrust, constant fear of losing what you had gained. Then your bodies, strange diseases, premature aging, unexplainable pain. And finally," Mike whispered. "Finally, your souls. You would become like those who created this diamond, cruel, greedy, willing to do anything to protect your wealth. And when you died, you would become part of the stone, more tears to be wept." John looked at his backpack, then at Mike, then back at the shadowy creature. His whole life he had dreamed of a moment like this, a chance to change everything, to become rich, to give his family a better life. But now, facing the real choice, he discovered there was something more important than money. "I can't," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't do this to my family. I can't carry that weight." He opened the backpack, pulled out the wrapped diamond, and gently placed it on the sand. Even through the cloth, the stone seemed to pulse with its own life.
Mike looked at the diamond, then at John, then at the creature. His hands clenched into fists, his whole body trembling with the effort of decision. "My whole life I've been poor," he said. "My whole life I dreamed of something like this. How can I just let it slip away?" "Because," John said softly, "some things cost more than they're worth." Mike stood there for a few more minutes, at war with himself. Finally, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "You're right," he sighed. "I always knew you were right." The creature watched in silence as the two men stepped away from the diamond. "A wise choice," it finally said. "Few are capable of making it." "What happens now?" John asked. "Now you go home," it said. "You return to your simple lives, to your families, to your honest work, and you forget this happened." "And Pete?" "Pete will be buried with honor. His family will receive a sum of money, not much, but enough to ease their immediate difficulties. She will think he died in a fishing accident." "Where will this money come from?" Mike asked. The creature pointed at the diamond abandoned in the sand. "There are ways to transform curse into blessing. When used wisely, to help instead of enrich, even this stone can bring some good to the world." John and Mike grabbed their canoes and started pushing them into the water. Before leaving, John turned once more. "Why did you give us a choice?" he asked. "Why not just kill us like, well, not like Pete, but—" "Because," the creature said, and for the first time its voice sounded almost human, "everyone deserves a chance to choose who they want to be. The real curse isn't in the stone, but in the inability to choose wisely when choice is offered." They paddled down river in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. The sun was setting, painting the sky red and gold, the same colors they'd seen in the diamond. When they finally got back to their town 3 days later, John and Mike discovered that something had changed in them. Not externally, they were still the same middle-aged fishermen who had left a week before, but internally they carried a wisdom they hadn't had before. They returned to their work on the river, but now they saw their simplicity as a blessing, not a curse. Their families noticed the change. There was a peace in them that hadn't existed before, a contentment that came from having faced ultimate temptation and chosen wisely. Pete's wife received, as promised, a sum of money. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to buy a small house and support her and the baby for a few years. The origin of the money remained a mystery. The lawyers said only that Pete had been a beneficiary of a distant inheritance. John and Mike never talked about what happened during those days upriver. Not to each other, not to their wives, not to anyone. It was as if they had made a silent pact to bury that experience deep in their memories. But sometimes, when they were fishing together on quiet afternoons, one of them would look up and see the other staring thoughtfully at the waters of the Colorado. And they knew they were thinking about the same thing, the sparkle of a diamond that could have changed their lives, and the wisdom of having chosen to leave it behind. Years passed. John aged gracefully, his hair turning completely white, but his eyes maintaining that deep peace he had found during those days on the river. His family prospered modestly. They were never rich, but never went without. Mike got married 2 years after the adventure, and his wife frequently commented on how he was different from other men in town. There was a maturity in him, a wisdom that seemed to come from someone much older. He smiled when she said this, but never explained why. Pete's widow raised her son alone, but with dignity. The boy grew up strong and honest, carrying the best traits of his father. She never knew the truth about how Pete died, but sometimes she dreamed of him, and in the dreams he seemed at peace, as if he had found some kind of redemption. A decade passed, then 2. The story of the 3 buddies could have ended there, another legend from the backwoods that fades with time. But the Colorado River keeps its secrets for a long time, and some secrets have a life of their own. It was on a November afternoon, almost 20 years after the original adventure, that John encountered the young man on the riverbank. He was fishing alone. Mike had died 2 years earlier, taken by a sudden fever, but he died smiling, holding his wife's hand, whispering something about having made the right choices in life. John missed him every day, but also felt grateful for the friendship they had shared. The young man couldn't have been more than 25. Tall, strong, with bright eyes full of ambition and discontent. John recognized him immediately, though he'd never seen him before. It was the look he himself had had in his youth, the look of someone who believes he deserves more than life has given him. "Sir," the young man said, approaching with a new canoe and expensive fishing equipment, "do you know this river well?" John nodded slowly. "Known it since I was a boy. Why?" "I'm looking for something," the young man said, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "I heard stories about hidden treasures upriver, diamonds, gold, riches enough to change a whole life." John's heart stopped for a moment. After so many years, the legend was still alive, still attracting young dreamers with promises of easy wealth. "I've heard those stories too," John said carefully, "but they're just stories, son. Legends that fishermen tell to pass the time." "That's what everyone says," the young man laughed, a harsh sound full of youthful arrogance. "But I've done my research, talked to prospectors, read old documents, studied maps. I know there's something up there." "And even if there was," John said, "you think it would be easy? That hundreds of men over the years wouldn't have tried?" "Maybe they didn't try the right way," Carlos replied. "Maybe they didn't have the necessary determination." John recognized the stubbornness in his voice, the same he himself had had 2 decades ago. He knew that nothing he said would dissuade the boy. Some lessons can only come through one's own experience. "What's your name, son?" "Carlos. Carlos Mendoza." "Well, Carlos," John said, "I'm going to give you some advice that someone should have given me when I was your age. Not every treasure that shines is worth finding." Carlos rolled his eyes. "Typical old fisherman. Y'all spent your whole lives here, resigned to poverty, and now you want everyone else to be resigned too." The words hurt, but John recognized them. They were almost identical to what he himself had thought about older fishermen when he was young. "Maybe," John said softly, "or maybe some of us learned there are things more important than wealth." "Like what?" John looked at the river, at the sun beginning to set, painting the waters gold. He thought of Mike, who had died peacefully in his bed. He thought of Pete, who had found some form of redemption even in death. He thought of his own decades of simple but real contentment. "Peace," he said finally, "peace with yourself." Carlos laughed again, but this time the sound was less confident. "Peace don't pay bills, old man."
"Neither do diamonds pay some bills," John replied, but he spoke so quietly he wasn't sure if Carlos had heard. The young man prepared to leave. "Well, thanks for the advice, I guess, but I'm gonna try anyway. I'm leaving next week." "Going alone?" "Got 2 buddies coming with me, all determined to change our lives." 3 buddies. John felt a chill run down his spine. Always 3 buddies. "Carlos," he said, more urgently now, "can I tell you a story? A real story, not a legend." The young man hesitated, clearly impatient, but something in John's tone made him stop. "What kind of story?" "The story of 3 buddies who went looking for treasures upriver, and what they found there. Carlos sat on a rock, interested despite himself, and John began to tell the truth, the whole truth, for the first time in 20 years. He spoke about the journey upriver, about the abandoned camp, about the diamond they found. He spoke about how greed had poisoned their friendship, about Pete's mysterious death, about the creature they encountered in the forest. Initially, Carlos listened with obvious skepticism, but as the story progressed, his expression changed. There were too many details, too many real emotions for it to be invented. And there was something in John's eyes, an ancient sadness, a wisdom bought with suffering, that spoke of truth. You really want me to believe that there's a supernatural creature guarding cursed diamonds in the middle of the forest? I don't want you to believe anything, John replied. I just want you to think about what you're willing to sacrifice for what you think you want. Carlos was silent for a long moment. The sun had set completely now, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the dark sky. Even if your story was true, he said finally, how can I just give up? This might be my only chance to get out of poverty. What if it isn't? John asked. What if it's just your chance to discover you already had everything you needed? Easy for you to say. You're already old. You've already accepted your lot. I still got a whole life ahead of me. John nodded sadly. He recognized the logic. He'd used the same one 20 years ago. So you're going to leave anyway? I am, Carlos said, but his voice didn't sound as confident anymore. In that case, John said, standing up slowly, let me give you something. He went to his canoe and pulled out a small leather pouch from inside an equipment box. Inside the pouch was a small stone, the size of a coin, but smooth and perfectly round. What is this? A river stone, John said, but special. Found it the day I came back from that trip 20 years ago. Been carrying it with me ever since. Why? To remind me that some of the most valuable things we have are also the simplest. This stone ain't worth nothing in money, but it's worth everything in memories. Carlos took the stone, feeling its small but solid weight in his palm. Why are you giving this to me? Because, John said, if you're really going to make this trip, I want you to take something with you that reminds you there's another path. When you're up there, when you find what you're looking for, hold this stone and remember that wealth without wisdom is just poverty in disguise. Carlos pocketed the stone, but his features remained determined. Thanks for the stone and the story, Mr. John, but I gotta try. John nodded. He'd done what he could. The rest was up to Carlos himself. One last thing, he said, as the young man was already walking away. If you really find what you're looking for, remember, the most important choice you'll make won't be how to use what you found, but whether you should use it at all. Carlos waved without turning around and disappeared into the darkness. John never saw him again. But 1 week later, he heard from other fishermen that 3 young men had left upriver with mining equipment and big plans. And a month later, he heard that only 2 had returned. He looked for the 2 survivors, but they had left town immediately after returning. Nobody knew where they'd gone or what had happened to the 3rd member of the group. John never knew whether Carlos was the one who died or one of those who survived. But sometimes, on quiet nights, when he fished alone under the stars, he held a small, smooth stone in his hand and wondered if somewhere another young man was learning the difference between what we want and what we need. The Colorado River kept flowing, as it always had, as it always would, carrying secrets in its dark waters, whispering legends to those who knew how to listen, offering choices to those brave or foolish enough to seek them. And in its depths, guarded by forces few dare to understand, a diamond waits patiently for the next trio of dreamers who believe they can carry its weight. because there will always be three buddies, there will always be the promise of easy wealth, and there will always be the choice between what shines and what's really worth having. The river knows this, the waters remember, and the story continues, one generation after another, waiting to see who will be wise enough to choose honest poverty over cursed wealth. To this day, fishermen along the Colorado River tell stories about diamonds lost in the deep waters, about shadowy creatures that guard ancient treasures, about three buddies who found more than they were looking for and less than they expected. But the stories are just echoes now, whispers of a truth that few dare to believe. And maybe that's for the best, because some truths are too heavy to be carried by those who aren't ready for them. The diamond waits, the river flows, and the choice, eternal and unchanging, remains. What are you willing to sacrifice for what you think you want? In the end, it's always the same question. And the answer, as John, Mike, and Pete discovered so many years ago, defines not only what we gain, but who we become in the process. The treasure chest of tales closes for now, but the story remains alive in the waters of the Colorado, waiting for the next brave soul to open it again.